The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes nervously. She had driven 3 hours to reach this military installation, clutching a worn letter in her sweaty palm. The document bore official seals and signatures, but after months of bureaucratic runaround, she wondered if anyone would even listen to her story. Sarah wasn't military personnel. She was a 32-year-old social worker from a small coastal town, but she carried something that made her different from every other civilian who might visit this base. Hidden beneath her long-sleeve shirt was a tattoo that told a story of sacrifice, honor, and a promise made in the darkest of circumstances. The security checkpoint buzzed with activity as morning shift changes began. Guards in crisp uniforms checked identification cards and waved through familiar faces. When Sarah approached the gate, she presented her driver's license and the official letter she'd received after months of persistent phone calls and emails to various military departments. The young corporal at the checkpoint squinted at the document, clearly puzzled by its contents. Sarah had requested permission to visit the base for what she called personal military business, but the vague nature of her request had raised flags throughout the chain of command. Nobody seemed to know exactly why this civilian woman needed to be on their secure facility. As Sarah waited, more personnel gathered around the checkpoint. She noticed whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Her heart rate increased as she realized how out of place she must look. The base commander had been notified of an unusual visitor, and security protocols demanded extra caution with anyone whose purpose seemed unclear. The atmosphere grew tense when 3 military police officers arrived at the scene. Their presence immediately changed the dynamic, and Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She tried to explain her situation again, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officials were more concerned with following proper procedures than understanding her unique circumstances. What nobody at that checkpoint knew was that Sarah's father had served with distinction in a classified naval operation 15 years earlier. Lieutenant Commander Robert Martinez had made the ultimate sacrifice during a rescue mission that saved 17 lives but cost him his own. The details of his heroism had been buried in classified files, and his family had been left with only basic information about his death. The commotion at the security gate grew louder as more personnel arrived to assess the situation. Sarah found herself surrounded by uniforms and suspicious faces, all demanding explanations she couldn't properly give, without revealing information she wasn't sure she was authorized to share. The stress of the moment, combined with the grief she still carried for her father, began to overwhelm her. In her frustration, Sarah rolled up her sleeve to wipe away tears that had begun to form. The movement revealed something that would change everything about this encounter, though nobody noticed it yet. The intricate tattoo on her forearm contained symbols and numbers that held deep significance within certain military circles. But to the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than decorative ink. The situation continued to escalate as base security prepared to escort Sarah off the premises. She had traveled so far and waited so long for this opportunity to honor her father's memory in the way he had requested in his final letter to her. The letter she carried contained his dying wish that she visit his old unit and deliver a message he had never been able to share with his fellow sailors. As the military police moved closer, Sarah's desperation grew. She knew she was moments away from being removed from the base, possibly banned from ever returning. All her months of planning and preparation seemed about to crumble because of a misunderstanding that she couldn't seem to resolve. The weight of failing to fulfill her father's final request pressed down on her like a physical force. The crowd around the checkpoint had grown to nearly 20 people, all drawn by the unusual commotion. Among them were sailors, Marines, and various base personnel, but none with the authority or knowledge to properly assess Sarah's situation. They saw only a civilian woman who appeared to be causing problems at their secure facility. Sarah's voice cracked as she made one final attempt to explain why she needed to be there. She spoke of honor, duty, and promises made to the dying, but her words seemed lost in the chaos of the moment. The officials were focused on protocol and security, not on the personal mission that had brought her to their gate. As handcuffs appeared and the situation reached its critical point, Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her father. She remembered his stories of naval brotherhood, of sailors who would do anything for each other, and of the bonds that transcended rank and regulation. She wondered if any of those bonds still existed in this place that had once been his second home. The sound of approaching footsteps suggested that her time was up. Someone with authority was finally coming to resolve this situation, though Sarah feared it would not be in her favor. She braced herself for the humiliation of being arrested in front of all these military personnel, knowing that her father would understand even if his final wish remained unfulfilled. The handcuffs clicked into place around Sarah's wrists as murmurs rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. She felt the cold metal against her skin and fought back tears of frustration and embarrassment. The military police officer who had restrained her spoke in clipped, professional tones about security violations and proper procedures, but Sarah barely heard the words over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Base personnel continued to gather, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a civilian being detained at their normally quiet checkpoint. Sarah noticed some of them taking photos with their phones, and she wondered how this moment would be remembered. Would anyone ever understand that she had come here with nothing but respect and a desire to honor her father's service? The senior military police officer began reading Sarah her rights, while another prepared paperwork for her removal from the base. They moved with efficient professionalism, having handled similar situations before. To them, this was simply another case of a civilian who had overstepped boundaries. Despite whatever sob story she might be telling, Sarah's rolled-up sleeve had fallen back down during the arrest, once again concealing the tattoo that might have changed everything. The intricate design remained hidden beneath the fabric, its significance unknown to everyone present. The symbols and numbers inked into her skin told a story that none of these people were equipped to read, even if they had seen it clearly. As the paperwork proceeded, Sarah found herself thinking about the long drive home she would soon be making. She imagined having to call her mother and explain that she had failed to complete her father's final mission. The disappointment would be crushing, not just for herself, but for the entire family who had supported her efforts to reach this military base. The crowd began to disperse as the initial excitement of the situation wore off. People returned to their duties and routines, leaving behind only the essential personnel needed to process Sarah's removal. She felt increasingly isolated as the number of witnesses dwindled, making her situation feel even more hopeless than before. One young sailor lingered longer than the others, studying Sarah's face with curiosity rather than suspicion. Something about her presence seemed familiar to him, though he couldn't place exactly what. He had heard stories from older sailors about family members who sometimes tried to visit the base for personal reasons, usually related to deceased relatives who had served with honor. The sailor approached the senior officer handling Sarah's case and asked if he could review the documentation she had brought. The officer, busy with other matters, handed over Sarah's letter without much thought. As the young man read the official text, his expression changed from casual interest to something approaching recognition. Meanwhile, Sarah's mind drifted to memories of her father during his active duty years. She remembered him describing the naval base as a place where honor mattered more than bureaucracy, where sailors looked out for each other regardless of rank or background. The reality of her current situation seemed to contradict everything he had told her about military brotherhood. The young sailor who had been reading her documentation suddenly straightened up, his eyes widening as he processed certain details in the letter. He quickly approached his immediate supervisor, speaking in urgent whispers about something he had discovered. The supervisor, initially dismissive, became more attentive as the conversation continued. Sarah watched this exchange with growing hope, though she tried not to let her expectations rise too high. She had been disappointed too many times already in her efforts to gain access to the base. Still, something about the sailor's body language suggested that her situation might be more complex than anyone had initially realized. The supervisor took the letter from the young sailor and read it more carefully than anyone had done since Sarah's arrival. His face showed confusion, then concern, then something that might have been recognition. He immediately reached for his radio and began calling for someone with higher authority to come to the checkpoint immediately. As they waited for this new authority figure to arrive, Sarah noticed a change in how the military personnel around her were behaving. The casual dismissal had been replaced by something more respectful, though still cautious. Several people were now studying her documentation, with serious expressions rather than the cursory glances she had received earlier. The young sailor, who had first noticed something significant about Sarah's papers, approached her directly. He introduced himself as Petty Officer Williams and asked if she would mind answering a few questions about her father's service record. For the first time since her arrival, someone was treating her as more than just a problem to be solved. Sarah found herself able to speak more freely about her father's naval career, sharing details that she had memorized from his letters and the limited official information her family had received after his death. Petty Officer Williams listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific dates, locations, and unit designations that appeared in her documentation. As Sarah spoke about her father's service, she unconsciously gestured with her hands, causing her sleeve to shift and reveal just a glimpse of the tattoo beneath. Petty Officer Williams caught sight of something that made him pause mid-sentence. His attention suddenly focused on her forearm rather than her words. The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of someone with significantly more authority than anyone who had been present so far. The crowd of onlookers instinctively stepped back and assumed more formal postures as a figure in higher-ranking uniform approached the checkpoint. Sarah could sense that this person's involvement would either resolve her situation completely or make it much worse than it already was. Admiral Richardson emerged from a black military vehicle with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His silver hair was perfectly groomed beneath his officer's cap, and his uniform displayed ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of distinguished service. The assembled personnel immediately snapped to attention as he approached the checkpoint, their casual chatter replaced by respectful silence. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized this high-ranking officer had been called specifically to deal with her situation. In her experience, the involvement of someone this senior usually meant that problems were about to become much more serious. She prepared herself for what might be a very uncomfortable interrogation about her presence on the base. The Admiral's piercing blue eyes surveyed the scene methodically, taking in every detail from the handcuffed civilian to the nervous expressions of the junior personnel. He had built his career on the ability to quickly assess complex situations and make decisive judgments. Something about this particular incident had warranted his personal attention, though the initial reports had been vague. Petty Officer Williams stepped forward and saluted sharply before handing over Sarah's documentation. The Admiral accepted the papers without comment, his expression remaining neutral as he began to read. Sarah watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of what he might be thinking, but his years of command had taught him to keep his reactions carefully controlled. As Admiral Richardson read through the official letter Sarah had brought, his eyebrows rose slightly at certain passages. The document contained references to classified operations and personnel records that were not typically shared with civilian family members. The authorization signatures at the bottom bore the names of people he recognized from high levels of naval command. Sarah found her voice and attempted to explain her situation once more, though she kept her words respectful and brief. She spoke about her father's service, his final letter to her, and her months-long effort to gain access to the base for what she called a personal mission of honor. The Admiral listened without interruption, his attention focused entirely on her words. The crowd of onlookers maintained their respectful distance, but Sarah could feel their curiosity about what would happen next. Some of the younger personnel had never seen a civilian detained on base, especially not one whose case had drawn the personal attention of an admiral. The situation had clearly escalated beyond routine security procedures. Admiral Richardson finished reading the documentation and looked up at Sarah with an expression that seemed to contain recognition. He asked her father's full name, rank, and unit designation, questions that Sarah answered without hesitation. Her responses appeared to confirm something the Admiral had suspected based on the information in her letter. The Admiral then did something unexpected. Instead of addressing the security concerns or questioning Sarah's right to be on the base, he asked about the circumstances of her father's death. Sarah's voice grew quiet as she explained what little she knew about the classified mission that had claimed his life 15 years earlier, and how his final letter had requested that she visit his old unit with a personal message. As Sarah spoke about her father's sacrifice, she gestured toward the base buildings where he had once served. The movement caused her sleeve to slide up her arm, revealing more of the intricate tattoo than anyone had seen before. The design was clearly visible now, showing symbols and numbers that were definitely not random decorative elements. Admiral Richardson's eyes immediately locked onto the exposed tattoo, and his entire demeanor changed in an instant. What he saw there caused him to take a step closer to Sarah, his professional composure giving way to something approaching amazement. The symbols on her arm were not just military-related. They were specific to operations that very few people would have known about. The Admiral's recognition of the tattoo's significance was immediate and absolute. Those particular symbols and numbers represented one of the most classified rescue operations in recent naval history, an operation that had saved multiple lives but cost the life of one heroic sailor. The ink on Sarah's arm told a story that was known to only a handful of people, most of whom had sworn never to speak of it. Without taking his eyes off the tattoo, Admiral Richardson called for the immediate removal of Sarah's handcuffs. His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument, and the military police officers complied instantly despite their confusion about this sudden change in procedure. Sarah felt the metal restraints fall away from her wrists, though she remained puzzled about what had caused this dramatic shift. The Admiral studied the tattoo more closely, noting details that confirmed his growing understanding of who Sarah really was. The design included coordinates, dates, and symbols that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of classified operations. More importantly, it included elements that served as a form of authentication, proving the bearer's legitimate connection to events that officially never happened. Petty, Officer Williams and the other assembled personnel watched in bewilderment as their commanding officer's entire approach to the situation transformed. They had never seen Admiral Richardson react to anything with such immediate and profound recognition. Whatever he had seen in that tattoo had changed everything about how he viewed this detained civilian. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere but remained uncertain about what was happening. The Admiral's expression had shifted from professional skepticism to something that looked almost like respect, but she couldn't understand what had caused this transformation. All she knew was that the handcuffs were gone, and people were looking at her differently than they had moments before. The Admiral stepped back and regarded Sarah with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a tone of deep respect that had been completely absent during the initial confrontation. He asked Sarah a question that surprised everyone present, including herself, whether she understood the true significance of the ink she carried on her arm. Sarah looked down at her exposed tattoo with confusion, then back up at Admiral Richardson's intense gaze. She had always known the design was special, but she had never fully understood its deeper significance. Her father had drawn the intricate pattern himself during his final days in the hospital, insisting that she have it permanently inked on her arm as a way to carry his legacy and ensure his final message would reach the right people. The Admiral's voice softened as he began to explain what he was seeing. The symbols on Sarah's arm were not just military insignia or decorative elements. They were part of a recognition system used only by personnel involved in the most classified naval operations, a way for operatives to identify each other and verify their credentials without using traditional documentation that could be compromised or forged. As Admiral Richardson spoke, Sarah began to understand that her father had given her something far more significant than a simple memorial tattoo. The coordinates embedded in the design marked the exact location where he had made his final sacrifice. The numerical sequences represented the classified operation code and the date of the mission. Most importantly, the specific arrangement of symbols served as an authentication seal that proved her legitimate connection to events that most people would never know had occurred. The assembled personnel listened in respectful silence as the Admiral explained that Lieutenant Commander Robert Martinez had been posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during Operation Silent Storm, a rescue mission that had saved 17 sailors from a compromised position behind enemy lines. The details of his heroism had been classified not to hide shame, but to protect ongoing operations and the safety of other personnel who might face similar situations. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she learned for the first time about the true extent of her father's sacrifice. She had known he died serving his country, but the classified nature of his mission had left her family with only basic information. Now she was discovering that he had died not just as a sailor doing his duty, but as a hero whose actions had saved multiple lives. Admiral Richardson continued his explanation, describing how Lieutenant Commander Martinez had volunteered for a dangerous extraction mission when intelligence suggested that a reconnaissance team had been captured. Against orders and knowing the risks, he had entered hostile territory alone to provide cover for the rescue operation. His actions had allowed all 17 team members to reach safety, but he had paid for their lives with his own. The tattoo on Sarah's arm, the Admiral explained, was her father's way of ensuring that his final message would reach his surviving teammates. The specific symbols and arrangements would be recognized by any member of the original Operation Silent Storm team, serving as both identification and authentication of her right to speak on her father's behalf. Petty Officer Williams, who had been listening intently to the Admiral's explanation, suddenly stepped forward with recognition dawning in his eyes. He explained that his own grandfather had served in Operation Silent Storm, and had often spoken about a sailor named Martinez, who had saved his life and the lives of his teammates. The connection between past and present was becoming clear to everyone present. The Admiral asked Sarah if she understood the message her father had wanted her to deliver. She nodded and reached into her jacket pocket to retrieve a sealed envelope that she had carried with her throughout this entire ordeal. The letter inside contained her father's final words to his surviving teammates, words that he had been unable to share before his death. As Sarah prepared to hand over the envelope, Admiral Richardson explained that several members of the original Operation Silent Storm team were still serving at this base, though most had advanced in rank and responsibilities over the past 15 years. Her father's final message would finally reach the men whose lives he had saved, completing a circle that had been left open for far too long. The atmosphere around the checkpoint had completely transformed. Where there had been suspicion and security concerns, there was now deep respect and understanding. The personnel who had witnessed Sarah's arrest were beginning to comprehend that they had been present for something far more significant than a routine security incident. Admiral Richardson personally escorted Sarah toward the base interior, explaining that she would be given full honors as the daughter of a fallen hero. The military police who had detained her now served as an honor guard, their earlier actions forgotten in light of the new understanding of who she really was and why she had come to their base. As they walked, Sarah learned that Operation Silent Storm had become legendary within certain circles of the naval community. Stories of her father's sacrifice had been passed down through training programs and informal networks, inspiring a new generation of sailors to understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The Admiral revealed that a memorial wall inside the base headquarters contained her father's name along with other classified heroes whose sacrifices could not be publicly acknowledged. Sarah would finally be able to see her father honored in the way he deserved, surrounded by the names of others who had made similar sacrifices for their country and their fellow servicemen. The journey from the checkpoint to the base headquarters gave Sarah time to process everything she had learned. Her simple mission to deliver her father's final message had revealed a legacy of heroism that she had never fully understood. The tattoo on her arm was not just a memorial, it was a key that had unlocked 15 years of hidden history. As they approached the main building where her father's surviving teammates were waiting, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She was about to meet the men whose lives her father had saved, and she would finally be able to complete the mission he had entrusted to her during his final days. The interior of the base headquarters carried an atmosphere of solemn dignity that seemed fitting for the moment Sarah was about to experience. Admiral Richardson led her through corridors lined with naval history, past photographs of ships and sailors who had served with distinction throughout the decades. The building itself seemed to whisper stories of courage and sacrifice that most civilians would never hear. As they walked, word of Sarah's presence spread quickly through the base's communication networks. The story of Lieutenant Commander Martinez's daughter and her authenticated tattoo had reached the ears of several veterans who had served during the same era. Within minutes, arrangements were being made for an impromptu gathering of Operation Silent Storm survivors who were currently stationed at the base or living nearby. Admiral Richardson paused before a heavy wooden door, marked with security warnings and classification notices. Beyond this door lay the memorial room, where the names of classified heroes were honored in private ceremonies attended only by those with the highest security clearances. Sarah would be among the first family members ever granted access to this sacred space. The door opened to reveal a room that took Sarah's breath away. The walls were covered with black marble panels containing hundreds of names in gold lettering, each representing a sailor who had died in operations that could never be publicly acknowledged. The room was lit by soft overhead lighting that made the gold letters seem to glow against the dark stone background. Admiral Richardson guided Sarah to a specific panel near the center of the room, where her father's name was inscribed among those who had fallen during Operation Silent Storm. Lieutenant Commander Robert Martinez's name was etched in the same gold lettering as the others, but seeing it there made everything real for Sarah, in a way that no previous documentation ever had. As Sarah stood before her father's name, she heard footsteps behind her. 3 men in naval uniforms entered the room, their faces showing a mixture of anticipation and emotion that spoke to the significance of this moment. These were her father's surviving teammates. The men whose lives he had saved 15 years ago, now gathered to finally receive his last message. The oldest of the 3 men was Captain David Chen, who had been a young lieutenant during Operation Silent Storm. He approached Sarah with obvious emotion, explaining that her father had been his mentor and friend, someone who had taught him what it meant to be a naval officer. The rescue mission had been Captain Chen's first major operation, and he had never forgotten the debt he owed to Lieutenant Commander Martinez. Commander James Rodriguez, now serving as the base's intelligence officer, had been the communications specialist during the original mission. He described how Lieutenant Commander Martinez had maintained radio contact with the extraction team, even while under heavy fire, coordinating the rescue efforts that saved all 17 team members. His calm voice over the radio had been the last thing many of them heard before reaching safety. The third man was Master Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien, who had been a junior enlisted sailor during Operation Silent Storm. He told Sarah that her father had personally carried him to safety after he was wounded during the mission, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the increasing danger. O'Brien's career had been shaped by that act of heroism, inspiring him to dedicate his life to serving others. Admiral Richardson stepped back to allow Sarah privacy with the 3 survivors as she prepared to deliver her father's final message. She carefully opened the sealed envelope she had carried for so long, revealing a handwritten letter that bore her father's distinctive script. The paper was worn from being handled during his final days, but the words remained clear and powerful. Sarah read her father's message aloud, her voice growing stronger as she progressed through his final thoughts. He had written about the bond between sailors that transcended individual survival, about the importance of looking after each other's families, and about his pride in serving alongside men who would risk everything for their teammates. Most importantly, he had expressed his gratitude for the opportunity to save their lives, describing it as the most meaningful thing he had ever done. The letter concluded with specific messages for each of the survivors, personal words that showed how well Lieutenant Commander Martinez had known and cared for his teammates. He had asked them to take care of each other, and to remember that their survival gave meaning to his sacrifice. He wanted them to live full lives and to honor the memory of their shared service through their future actions. As Sarah finished reading, the 3 men stood in respectful silence, processing the final words from their fallen friend and mentor. Captain Chen wiped away tears as he thanked Sarah for completing her father's mission, explaining that these words had brought closure to questions they had carried for 15 years. They had always wondered what their teammate might have wanted to say if he had survived long enough. Commander Rodriguez spoke about the impact Lieutenant Commander Martinez had made on their lives and careers, describing how his example had influenced their approach to leadership and service. Master Chief O'Brien added that he had named his own son Robert in honor of the man who had saved his life, and he was grateful to finally meet the daughter of his hero. The reunion continued as the men shared stories about Sarah's father that she had never heard before. They described his sense of humor, his dedication to his family, and his unwavering commitment to his fellow sailors. These personal memories brought Lieutenant Commander Martinez to life in ways that official records and military honors never could. Admiral Richardson observed the emotional gathering with deep respect, understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The completion of Lieutenant Commander Martinez's final mission had brought healing not just to his daughter, but to the men whose lives he had saved. The circle of service and sacrifice had finally been closed after 15 years of waiting. As the formal ceremony concluded, the 3 survivors made a pact with Sarah to maintain regular contact and to share more stories about her father's life and service. They invited her to future reunions and ceremonies, welcoming her as an honorary member of their brotherhood. Her father's legacy would live on through their continued friendship and mutual support. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Sarah prepared to leave the naval base, but her departure would be vastly different from the arrest she had nearly faced that morning. Admiral Richardson had arranged for a formal escort to accompany her to the main gate, a gesture of respect that honored both her father's sacrifice and her own dedication to completing his final mission. As word of the day's events spread throughout the base, dozens of sailors and officers gathered along the route to pay their respects. Many of them had heard stories about Operation Silent Storm during their training or from veteran colleagues, and they understood the significance of meeting the daughter of Lieutenant Commander Martinez. The spontaneous honor guard formed naturally as personnel stepped out of buildings to acknowledge her presence. Sarah walked alongside Captain Chen, Commander Rodriguez, and Master Chief O'Brien, who had insisted on personally escorting her to ensure she received the recognition she deserved. The three men had spent the past several hours sharing memories and photographs of her father, creating a more complete picture of his life and service than she had ever possessed before. The base photographer had been summoned to document this historic moment, capturing images of Sarah standing before her father's memorial name and meeting with his surviving teammates. These photographs would become part of the official record, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of families honoring their fallen heroes in the military, community's obligation to support them. Admiral Richardson presented Sarah with a special commendation recognizing her dedication to completing her father's mission and honoring his memory. The citation acknowledged her perseverance in navigating military bureaucracy and her courage in carrying forward a legacy of service and sacrifice. More importantly, it formally recognized her status as an honored family member within the naval community. The Admiral also announced that Sarah would receive copies of previously classified documents related to her father's service, including detailed accounts of Operation Silent Storm and the specific actions that had earned him the Navy Cross. These materials would help her family finally understand the full scope of his heroism and sacrifice, filling in gaps that had existed for 15 years. As they approached the main gate where Sarah's journey had begun so dramatically, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred throughout the day. Her father's simple tattoo design had proven to be far more than a memorial. It had been a key that unlocked recognition, respect, and a deeper understanding of his legacy than she had ever imagined possible. The young Petty Officer Williams, who had first noticed something significant about Sarah's documentation, was waiting at the checkpoint to offer his personal apologies for the morning's misunderstanding. He explained that he had learned valuable lessons about looking beyond surface appearances and the importance of listening carefully to people's stories, especially when they involved military service and sacrifice. Sarah graciously accepted his apologies while emphasizing that everyone had been doing their jobs properly, according to established procedures. The security measures that had initially caused her problems were necessary protections for the base and its personnel. What mattered most was that the truth had eventually been recognized and her father's message had reached its intended recipients. The three Operation Silent Storm survivors presented Sarah with a special gift before her departure. They had quickly arranged for the creation of a replica of her father's Navy Cross, since the original had been buried with him according to military tradition. This new medal would allow her family to display a tangible symbol of his heroism while preserving the dignity of his final resting place. Captain Chen also gave Sarah a photograph from Operation Silent Storm that showed her father with his teammates before their final mission. The image captured a moment of camaraderie and confidence that spoke to the bonds between the men and their shared commitment to bringing everyone home safely. It was a treasure that no amount of money could have purchased. As Sarah reached her car, she paused to look back at the naval base that had initially seemed so unwelcoming, but had ultimately provided her with the closure and recognition her family had sought for so long. The buildings and facilities looked the same as they had that morning, but her perspective had been completely transformed by the day's revelations. The drive home would give Sarah time to process everything she had learned about her father's true legacy and the impact his sacrifice had made on the lives of his teammates. She would return to her family with stories that would help them understand why Lieutenant Commander Martinez had been so dedicated to his naval service and why his final mission had been so important to him. Admiral Richardson's final words to Sarah had been a promise that her father's story would continue to inspire future generations of naval personnel. The details of Operation Silent Storm would eventually be declassified, allowing Lieutenant Commander Martinez's heroism to be publicly recognized and celebrated. His sacrifice would serve as an example of the highest ideals of naval service. As Sarah drove away from the base, she touched the tattoo on her arm with new understanding and appreciation. What had begun as a memorial to a father she missed had become a symbol of honor, sacrifice, and the enduring bonds between those who serve their country. Her father's final message had been delivered, but his legacy would continue through the lives he had saved, and the family who would never forget his heroism. The setting sun cast long shadows across the highway as Sarah headed home, carrying with her the closure that had eluded her family for 15 years. Her father's mission was finally complete, and his memory would be honored by those who understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and the brotherhood that binds all who wear the uniform.